presentation is part 2 of the basics of questionnaires, and I'm going to talk a bit about developing response sets for closed item questions. So in the prior presentation, I just gave an overview of what questionnaires are and then how to develop stems for items. And so I'm going to focus on 4 different main sets of response sets that you can have when you develop closed-ended items. So those are rating scales, dichotomous response sets, check all that apply, or rank order. So first of all, let's talk about rating scales. Okay, so the first and often common type of response set that is used in social science research are called scales. Essentially, scales are just values placed along some continuum that match your question. So the easiest way to show this is through examples, right? So you can have scales that get at people's agreement, people's satisfaction, people's evaluation, people's knowledge, also frequency or intensity, that kind of thing. So for instance, a very common type of scale are agreement scales, which are also referred to as Likert, L-I-K-E-R-T. Even though it looks like Likert, it's actually Likert. He was a psychologist at the University of Michigan back in the 40s. And so he developed a scale to get at the level of agreement that people had with different kinds of statements. So strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. And you can see the other examples up there on the slide of different types of scales that you could have. So as the example in the bottom shows, usually those giving people the option to respond with scales rather than dichotomously is good when you're trying to measure behavior, emotions, or feelings, because people usually aren't super black and white about a lot of things, and so usually emotions and behaviors can be captured better on relative scales rather than just dichotomously. So for instance, rather than asking someone's enjoyment with maybe a classroom activity and just saying, okay, did you enjoy that? Yes or no? Maybe it's better to ask them to characterize their level of enjoyment on a scale, maybe a 4-point scale from not at all, a little, somewhat, or very much. So scales are very commonly used, and they're really nice to try to measure people's emotions or behaviors. So when you're creating a scale, how many categories should you include? Should you include, 6 or 10 or what? It really depends on what you're measuring, but the recommendation is typically between 3 and 7. So you don't want to give people too many categories because it can be unwieldy and it can distract them trying to figure out exactly where to place their feelings or their emotions or their frequency. So there's certainly no standard, and you want to operate based on sort of your item and your judgment, but typically between 3 and 7 categories is the recommendation. So one issue when you're using scales in your research is whether or not to use a neutral option or a midpoint. So for instance, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, or neither agree nor disagree, or no opinion, sort of a midpoint or neutral sort of option on your scale. And really, among survey researchers, there's disagreement as to whether or not you should use one or not, even on the same survey. So these 2 examples are from the National Study of Student Engagements, one of their surveys, and they used some midpoints on items like the one on the left, and then they didn't use midpoints on items like the one on the right. So really there's no sort of like consensus among survey researchers whether or not a midpoint should be used. So it's your judgment as a researcher whether or not you want to use a midpoint if you're using scales or not. So another question that comes up when people are deciding on response sets to include is whether or not to include a don't know option or not relevant option. And it is true that when you include a don't know option, people will be more likely to say, maybe I don't know the response to this, than if you don't offer that as an alternative. So really, it's up to you, again, as a researcher. If you think it's reasonable to include that, you can. But you certainly should include it as part of the response set, not as a separate question. So you should have your options in terms of your scale. So let's say it's disagree, neutral, agree, and then at the end of that list of options, you should say don't know or not relevant or not applicable. It shouldn't be a separate question. But the important thing, actually, is that you can also phrase your item STEM in a way that gives respondents confidence that they should be able to respond. So you can think about ways to not even need a don't know or not relevant response. So for instance, here, income is a notoriously difficult information to collect from people, especially when you're asking students about their parents' income. So if you're interested in getting a students, measuring students' family income, this is a good way to word it. So a lot of times students will be just right off the bat say, I have no idea what my parents' income was. And so if you had that as an option on a question about income, they probably would mark don't know. But you can force them to try to respond by saying something like, what is your best estimate of your parents' total income last year? Consider all income from all sources before taxes. So even though that's a really hard thing to answer, you want to get at students' relative idea about it, and you don't want to give them don't know, because probably most of them would say, I don't know. So you can try to think about ways to phrase a question to try to say, okay, so we understand you probably don't have a really clear idea of this, but just give us your best estimate of what you think. So definitely some information that you're going to ask about can just be you can just give your respondents a dichotomous set of options. So usually that would be yes or no. So here's a good example. Since leaving high school, have you ever taken courses, whether for credit or not, at any other institution? Yes or no. I mean, there's really no sort of scale you'd want to ask about. You just need to know yes or no. Have you taken any other courses for credit after high school, right? So that's certainly an alternative to scales. Okay, so another type of response set are check all that apply. So in this case, you present your respondent with an array of choices that they can simultaneously review and select all that apply to their experiences. Again, the idea is not to be discriminating, but it's to be very inclusive. And so you can use check all that apply items for factual information as well as to capture opinions and attitudes. But what is important when you're going to use those response sets is making sure that you give the full range of possible options that could be out there. So in a lot of cases, if I'm going to do a check all that apply, I'll add, as this example shows, an option for someone to check other and specify, if just in case my list of options weren't totally inclusive to their experience. Okay, so another type of response set are what's called rank-ordered response sets. And essentially, those are when you give your respondent a set of items and you ask them, based on your own guidelines, to rank order their choices from highest to lowest. These are totally valid, but oftentimes it can make data analysis different. And so typically when I am creating a set of items that I want rank ordered, I'll use a scale instead. And so for instance, here's a good example of what I do. So let's say you want to ask faculty what they think is most important on their campuses. And so you've generated a huge list of things that you want to know about how important they think these different dimensions or issues are on their campuses. So how important do they think undergraduate majors are, graduate programs, resources for research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So rather than saying, can you please rank order what you think is most important to least important, what you could do is just give a importance scale along with each one of them and have them go through and say to what degree do they characterize each of these from very low to very high. So that's another way to get at the idea of rank ordering things using importance scales like that. But also you could have them just go through and number from 1 to 12 what they think is most important to least important. A few just general reminders when you're developing response sets. You want to make sure they're both mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So first of all, mutually exclusive, that means making sure your categories don't overlap. Seems obvious, but for instance, you can run into issues like the one up above. So let's say you're asking, how old are you? From 0 to 5, 5 to 10, or 10 to higher, 10 or older. So if you're 5 or if you're 10, which one would you pick, right? So you want to make sure that you are creating categories that don't overlap and are mutually exclusive, but also are inclusive and exhaustive. So for instance, the second one would be a bad example of a non-exhaustive set of response sets, right? So if you ask people, indicate your favorite campus eatery, Starbucks or Subway. So of course, those are not the only eateries on campus. And so that would not be an exhaustive set of response options. So kind of obvious, but you need to also be attentive to these issues. So just some final tips generally when you're doing your response sets. So you want to make your choices be in a logical order. You don't want to say, okay, I'm going to use a Likert scale on agreement, but I'm going to start with strongly disagree, then I'm going to go to strongly agree, then I'm going to go to slightly disagree, then I'm going to go to slightly agree. You want to do it in sort of a logical order. And so you can either do it conceptually, let's say, if you're going to ask people to pick their major from a list, maybe you'll put all the social sciences together, you'll do it, and then you'll do all the business majors together, engineering, all the engineering majors together, that kind of thing. So conceptual ordering, or you could do it numerically. Oftentimes when you're asking about numbers, it's best to do them in orders like, salary ranges, the example I had on a couple slides ago. Nothing else, just sort your response options alphabetically. And as some of my examples showed, I think it's useful often to put an other, please specify choice. If you're not certain that the response sets you've given are essentially exhaustive. It's a good kind of little escape valve, right? So that if you don't need to worry if you've missed some minor choices or that kind of thing. And one thing, just in terms of a best practice, when you're developing or using questionnaires, it is really important to get feedback from both from people maybe who you could consider to be experts in terms of other people in your office, that kind of thing, as well as from potential respondents. So pilot testing is really useful. Actually administer the survey or the survey instrument to the students or the faculty or the staff members who you're intending to actually participate in your study, to make sure both your wording is appropriate as well as you're capturing all of the constructs you want to capture correctly. In class, we're going to hopefully have some time to workshop some ideas and develop questions. We'll definitely look at some examples of questionnaires and some examples of poorly worded items in class to give you more practice sort of identifying and critiquing instruments that are out there. So definitely, again, as usual, come to class prepared with any questions you have about the presentations that you've viewed this week, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time to practice and better learn about some of these ideas there.